first term of our second year at college, we were scheduled to do teaching practice. I was placed in primary school in North Manchester and given several different age groups to teach. At this point, both my brothers and my sister-in-law were teachers, and although they all taught different subjects, it gave me a peek into their lives. I loved teaching and saw how close in many ways it was to acting. It was necessary to give a kind of performance and to keep children interested in what you had to say. The 6 weeks' practice culminated in a nativity play, which I had helped to get together, along with one of the class teachers, Mrs. Forbes, a nice woman I immediately talked to. On the afternoon of the first performance, I was in charge of the sound cues and sat on the side of the little stage with a small cassette player at the ready, in full view of the audience. With a sign from Mrs. Forbes, who was standing at the other side of the stage, also in full view of the audience, I pressed the play button. Mrs. Forbes' sign, although she was a matter of feet from me, was achieved by stretching her arms straight up towards the ceiling and waving it slowly from side to side, as if she were on a crowded beach and needed to be seen, which consequently drew all eyes towards me. My first cue was a beautiful rendition of In the Bleak Midwinter, which in turn was the cue for Mary and Joseph to enter, which they did, trudging wearily across the stage. Then after another huge wave from Mrs. Forbes on the far side, with the audience's heads swivelling Wimbledon-like from her to me, I faded the music out and the narration began. This was read by one of the 11-year-olds, describing how Mary and Joseph had walked for miles, Mary heavy with child, and how they had battled through the wind and the snow. This was my next cue. But instead of the sound of a howling gale, out from the little cassette, loud and clear, came instead the sound of pouring rain, accompanied by great claps of thunder. Mary and Joseph stopped in their tracks and looked helplessly towards Mrs. Forbes, who was now standing opposite, doing big winding actions with her hand, interspersed with dragging her forefinger across her throat. Now in panic mode, I tried to fast-forward the tape, and squeaking and squealing Disney-like, it whizzed on to what I hoped was the next cue. But when I pressed the play button, blaring out into the hall came a police siren. People were beginning to whisper and giggle, at which Mrs. Forbes' winding action now went up a notch into a rotating blur of overdrive. I then decided that perhaps rewind was the best course of action, and whizzed the tape backwards, randomly stopping and inwardly begging the gods to make something sensible come out. But no, this time we were treated to gunshots and the galloping of horses. However, Mary and Joseph, who had been glued to the spot since the thunderstorm had set in, decided to do a bit of improvising. And on hearing the shots, Joseph threw Mary to the ground. Causing her to let out what sounded like a rather real scream. Covering her with his cowl, he proceeded to hold the unseen gunmen at bay and pick them off one at a time with his staff, which miraculously had turned into a rifle. Mrs. Forbes was now fairly whipping her hand across the face. So much so that I feared she might do herself a damage. I pressed stop, plunging us into a sudden and much appreciated silence. Everyone froze. Mrs. Forbes, with her hand across her throat, looking as if she was striking an old-fashioned photographic pose. And nobody spoke. Joseph made one more half-hearted popping sound, directing a last shot at the enemy. Silence again. No one moved. Then, from underneath the cowl, Mary yelped, "Ow! You're on my hair!" And Joseph, raising his eyes to heaven, shifted. Just as Mrs. Forbes was about to come to the rescue, the narrator said, "And Joseph killed every one of those muggers." And they went on their way to Bethlehem. yeah.